Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Morgannin here on behalf of World of Piranha Bytes, bringing you a long overdue video discussing some of the observations we have made from the presentation of ELEX at Gamescom 2016, as well as some of the previous conferences, which I simply did not have the time to make a proper video for. So, before we take too long over explaining this video, what this is going to be is a three-part video. In the first part, we are discussing some of the observations we made from the gameplay video that we've seen presented at Gamescom. The second part of the video will be discussing the presentation from a representative during the demo. And the third part of the video will be discussing some of the observations and information we have from previous conferences, as well as from the Q&A threads on the World of ELEX forums and the ELEX official forums. So the first thing anybody's likely to notice and observe from these gameplay videos would be the graphics, which are a little underwhelming, but bear in mind this is still pre-alpha, some of these textures are subject to change, plenty of post-effects may not have been implemented yet, but so far, just off of what we see now, it seems like the sun is really oppressive in this area of the world that they're showing. Texture quality is substandard, but there are some nice shadows and lighting effects, and some of the, honestly, the more advanced cloth physics that I think I've seen in the game to date. And they've done a good job disguising some of the, low-res ground textures with an impressive amount of foliage density. Now, there's been a lot of contention among observers and fans in the forums over the combat animations. Now, again, this is a pre-alpha, and the developers have stated that these are just placeholder animations that will improve. But my biggest concern, in all honesty, is just how slow they are and how that affects gameplay. Because believe it or not, animations can affect gameplay. A lot of people say even if it's badly animated, it doesn't affect gameplay, but it really can. And in this case, I think it does, because there are occasions where you can actually observe the player character simply walking away from enemies who are unable to hit them, even as they're flailing their weapon at the player's back. And just everything seems too telegraphed, and it's just really concerning that you can predict everything an enemy's doing and simply evade it with no real skills or player reflexes or anything like that. And I certainly hope that the animations are sped up, even if they aren't changed over the rather stiff and awkward swings that we see going on here. A nice observation as far as animations is that drinking animations have returned in this game, something that we have not seen since the first Risen, and it seems like the animation lasts as long as it takes to recover from full health, or recover to full health, rather. So if your health bar is lower and you start drinking a potion, you have to continue drinking it until your health bar is full. I don't know if you can cancel it. That's not something that I've seen done, but it does seem to balance it in a way so you can't simply just walk away, quickly down a potion and get back into the fight. You have to make sure that you finish the potion and get your health back to full. Now, as far as combat is concerned, we have seen a small variety of firearms and melee weapons so far, which I believe we will continue to see more as development proceeds, but I'm honestly kind of impressed with the variety that we've seen so far in how these weapons can operate and their special properties. For example, the flaming sword can ignite foes, the chainsaw sword, according to Jenny in the World of ELEX forums, can cause foes to bleed and deal extra damage over time. The plasma rifle fires slow-moving projectiles and has a fairly slow rate of fire, and the grenade launcher could knock enemies off their feet. Now, the biggest concern that I have is that some of these weapons, especially the firearms, can be really overpowered, but we have been reassured that they will balance it in a variety of ways, which I will get into more once we reach the third section of this video. Now, jetpack combat seems to involve some sort of plunging attack, which knocks enemies aside and does quite a bit of damage, and there's a lot of concern that this attack can be spammed and it's really overpowered. That's really not something we can tell, because we haven't been able to see how this might be limited in the final product. There are environmental hazards which can be used as weapons, such as oil barrels that can be shot and explode to knock enemies away and deal a lot of damage, soften up targets before you really get into the fight. Now, so far we've only seen two factions really in the area, in the wilderness outside of this central city that we did not see the inside of in any of these videos. The outlaws, aka bandits, are hiding in various ruins and really seem to have the run of the place outside the walls. You know, they're in a lot of the ruins, they're patrolling, and it just seems like they kind of have the run of the place. But the Albs, the antagonist faction, are also seen as well, guarding certain locations, and they have their mechs on patrol. So it seems like this is going to be a central area of conflict in the game. Now, it does seem like horizontal movement with the jetpack is pretty limited, which prevents players from using it too evasively. You cannot just take the jetpack, fire yourself 20 miles down the line, and escape from enemies. Its principal strength is traveling in a vertical direction, so you can't really wander too far with it. Now, we saw the player character picking up items called ELEX. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but that it seems to be the form of currency in this game world, and is presumably a particular form of ELEX that is used as a currency. It remains to be seen if there's an actual gameplay function for it, or even just a story-wise function for it. That's something we'll find out once we actually get our hands on the game, I'm sure. Now, what I've seen is that armor seems to consist of 5 pieces, so it's not individual armor sets like it was in the old Gothic games, but rather you have head armor, torso, legs, and hands, similar to the later Risen games, as well as a neck slot, which is presumably reserved for accessories such as amulets, necklaces, and that kind of thing. Haven't seen that confirmed because that slot did not seem to be used by any of the players during the demo. Now, during combat, there is a combo meter, which we have seen before and has been somewhat described in some of the discussions, especially in the forums, and it builds up as you perform combo attacks and you time your attacks correctly. And it seems like the meter will deplete when it's not used in combat, so the special attacks that you acquire by building up this combo meter will be lost if you do not use them during the fight. And it does seem like the plunge attack from the jetpack partially consumes the combo meter, but I can't really confirm that. It's possible that it simply dissipated because he was not sustaining his combo. I don't really know yet. That remains to be seen. Now, in place of treasure chests and that sort of thing in the old games, locked security safes can either be hacked through the digital lock, or the player can seek out the key code. And that seems to be the primary encouragement for the player to explore, to find alternative ways to get into locked areas and safes that you do not have the technical skill to break into. Now, we've seen the mech enemies, which were highly advertised in the early development of this game, and it seems like while they were touted as extremely tough and enemies that were used to lock the player out of certain late game areas, it seems they look incredibly easy in the demos. Now, obviously, the main demo, they probably had the player character is probably a lot stronger than he would be at that point in the game, but it just seems like he takes them down so easily, and avoiding their attacks is not that difficult. So it seems like these enemies are not really going to be as fearsome as they ought to be. Now, we've seen a few roaming NPCs in this demo, which in this case seem to include traveling traders. So it is interesting to note that there will be NPCs that actually wander around the game world instead of just performing, designated tasks in a single area. So that's quite interesting to see as well, and it seems to change the dynamic nature of the NPC routines in a pretty significant way. Now, apart from gameplay videos, we have also seen a teaser trailer, which has not been officially released yet. Hopefully that'll happen soon so we can get a better look at it. But one part of the trailer does seem to imply that there are going to be 4 companions in this game. Now, we have heard about companions, and that they are going to follow the player much like they did in the later Risen games, but I'll discuss that a bit more in the next section. What is interesting is that they seem to be one character from each of the 4 factions, including the Albs, which is interesting since they are an antagonist faction and do not in any way work together with the other factions. So it is likely that this character is an exile from the elves who is also marked for death, much like the player character is. And he may indicate that there are even more former elves exiled from their faction that can enlighten the player on how elf society works and possibly help us in the global conflict later in the story. Now, the video teaser also seems to show some kind of weird mutant or fanatical humans. It's difficult to say because they do not appear heavily mutated and instead look like they're wearing masks or something. And it's odd because their appearances do not match with any of the known factions so far, so it could indicate another alternative faction, one that we can't join in the game and is possibly just an antagonist, or they could just be a type of mutated enemy that we will encounter in the game. So moving on to Section 2, we are going to discuss some of the statements made by the representative during the presentation at Gamescom. Now, this whole presentation is actually in English, so if you want to watch it for yourself, I will link it in the description below, and you can make your own observations from there. But I'm going to discuss some of the things he said and my thoughts on the matter. Now, it's important to note that these statements appear to be from a THQNordic rep and not a Piranha Bytes representative. So these statements should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, since they're not coming from the developers themselves, instead coming from the guy trying to sell the game. So don't take everything he says at face value. Some of it might be embellished or exaggerated for PR reasons. Now, this representative put an emphasis on the story adapting to your decision to kill important NPCs. We've heard before that most NPCs in the game can be killed, except for ones that are absolutely critical to finishing the game. So they really seem to be emphasizing that every action you take has a consequence, including killing NPCs that may affect how the story plays out. Now, this sort of thing has been touted by developers before, the so-called butterfly effect, but usually what we see is that just by killing that NPC, his role in the story becomes irrelevant, it's just removed, and he simply doesn't matter in the story anymore. So it remains to be seen how much of an impact killing these NPCs is really going to have. Now, the representative has also stated that the horizon will be completely accessible, so even the far distant peaks you can reach and scale to the top of, aided by the jetpack. Now, it's common for developers and publishers to say that their world is so big and you can reach everything, and, if you see that mountain over there, you can climb to the top of it, and, in a lot of cases, the landscape design is specifically made to ensure that you cannot reach everything, just to make the world look bigger when you can't actually get out there. But Piranha Bytes has really emphasized that they are trying to make this a big, expansive world with a lot of content in that, there's no artificial barriers to stop you from exploring. So hopefully this is not just an exaggeration and is something that is really going to, we're really going to be able to explore everything and find our way to, reach every corner of the world possible. The representative stated that this particular demo took place in the region known as Abessa, a rocky, lightly wooded land surrounding a large domed city. Now, the website claims that this city is home to the so-called free people. However, the representative stated that it's controlled by the clerics. And this discrepancies disturbed me for a little while, but I did get an answer from Jenny in the World of ELEX forums that suggested that the clerics may control the city, but their dominion over the city is very shaky, hence the outlaws nearby and supposed free people dwelling within. And they might actually be working similarly to the Don's men in Harbor City and Risen to overthrow the very shaky administration of the ruling party. And that may actually be a part of the conflict that you can assist in. The representative stated that weapons could not only be crafted from raw materials, but could also be enhanced and enchanted to add a lot more variety. And we did hear from Jenny more details in that regard, which I will discuss in the next section. As far as combat is concerned, the representative stated that some enemies in the game will also have jetpacks and can be used in combat against the player to balance out the player's own use of the jetpack. This is not something we saw in the demo. It's probably a feature that they have not added yet, something that they have not scripted the AI to take advantage of yet. So that remains to be seen. We'll probably see more of that once the beta version is open to observation. Now, as far as the factions are concerned, the representative stated that the different factions will have different relationships with each other, so they're not exclusively enemies. For example, the clerics are more hostile towards the lawless outlaws than they are against the berserkers, given the clerics' emphasis on law and order, and the outlaws insist philosophy of every man for himself, survival of the fittest, that kind of thing. It was claimed that around 60 to 100 hours of gameplay are possible. This is assuming that you do just about everything in the game, and again, these figures tend to be exaggerated in the pre-release demonstrations for large RPGs like this, so take that, again, with a grain of salt. We'll see what actually comes of it. As far as the companions, the representative stated that positive relationships with companions might even lead to romance options, which the representative kind of stumbled over this bit, so I don't really think that's going to be true. It remains to be seen, of course, but that's not really Piranha Bytes' forte, and it just does not seem like it's going to be something that they actually do. That's a BioWare thing. Now, we've heard before that the starting region for the player is going to be the forest area controlled by the Berserker faction, and the representative stated that this was actually a deliberate choice in order to expose the player, who's probably mostly used to the fantasy RPG settings of the previous Piranha Bytes games, expose them to the more familiar fantasy side of ELEX before exposing them to the more science fiction side, just to kind of ease the player into it and make them more comfortable. The representative finally stated that special equipment like the Flaming Sword can only be acquired by siding with a relevant faction. This does seem to conflict with some of the statements that we've heard from Piranha Bytes before, which was that you can get just about every weapon in the game, but you cannot necessarily learn how to use it properly if you are not sided with the faction that uses that type of weapon. It will see how this really works out, but it's possible that certain weapon upgrades are only available to certain factions. Okay, so that's everything we got from the Nordic Games presentation. And moving on to some of the Q&A information and the details that we got from some of the previous conventions. Which, again, I apologize, I did not have time to produce a video for these previously, so we're just going to try and run through them pretty quickly. Now, it was stated, I believe by Jenny, that there will be about 10 hours of gameplay before the player must commit to a faction to advance the story, so this is meant to give the player a lot of time to expose themselves to these factions and, decide which one is the best fit for them. There's actually, quite surprisingly for a Piranha Bytes game, there's supposed to be an open-ended story, so the game will continue after the credits, allowing the player to complete side quests and experience the world that has changed according to their actions in the main story. We all know that Piranha Bytes usually has a main story, you reach the end, kill the final boss, credits roll, game over. So this is very surprising, and I'm curious to see how it works out for them. Players with a bounty from a certain faction, that is, you committed a crime against this faction and they have put a price on your head, you must acquit yourself with the leaders of these factions, or else these leaders will send bounty hunters after the player, and they will pursue you until you or they are dead. And this, I imagine, would lock you out of plenty of faction quests and other advantages until you manage to acquit yourself. But, there might be a special reward to actually pissing off these factions and dealing with the hunters that come your way. As we stated, the story will begin in Edan, which is the region mostly controlled by the Berserkers, and they will be the first faction that the player will encounter in the game. So it's similar to, for example, the old camp in the first Gothic. They are just the easiest, most accessible faction, and will kind of give you I imagine is meant to really give you a footing to branch out and encounter the other factions in turn. Now, I mentioned earlier the combo meter that is going to be part of the combat system in this game. And just to clarify on that a bit more, the combo meter is a mechanic in which successive attacks that are timed properly will build a meter, and once that meter reaches a certain threshold, you can launch a more powerful attack. In order to fill the meter, your attacks have to be timed with cues on the screen. And related to that, the difficulty options in the game will allow you to change more specific difficulty options instead of just, easy, medium, and hard. Instead of just straight up stat bonuses for enemies, you can actually fine-tune certain mechanics according to your preference, such as the timing of attacks for the combo meter and how many enemies can attack the player at a single time. So I do really respect them for actually adding a lot more difficulty options, which most developers don't really bother to do. Now, as I stated, it seems like most weapons should be accessible to player, regardless of your faction affiliation, but the skills unique to each faction can only be learned by being a part of it. And there is an emphasis on some amount of adaptability between factions while maintaining their unique exclusivity. So you can probably arm yourself with melee weapons, even if you're a cleric. You can probably find guns, even if you're a berserker, but you won't find a berserker willing to teach you how to use them. Now, it has not been confirmed, but it is suggested that it will be possible to upgrade the jetpack and modify it in many ways. But again, this has not been confirmed. The jetpack has been somewhat, as I stated, a bone of contention among fans, especially in the German forums. I did not really get a chance to read into that too much, but it sounds like Piranha Bytes might be going back to the drawing board a bit as far as the jetpack is concerned, just to make sure that it is not overpowered and game-breaking. So it's possible that will start off kind of weak and not very useful, but you can invest in it and make it an actual, reliable part of your arsenal. As far as the jetpack is concerned, Jenny stated that this jetpack was actually introduced to try and encourage Piranha Bytes level designers and challenge them to create a world that relied less on artificial barriers and give you a truly immersive world that is completely open and every square inch of it is accessible. So this again really seems to emphasize their desire to produce a world that has complete freedom, and you can reach anywhere even if they didn't really mean for you to reach it. But it sounds to me like they really want to drive this point home, so here's hoping they can pull it off the way they really want to. Now, some publications seem to state that the game world of ELEX will actually be 6 times larger than Gothic 3, but Jenny has given a much more modest estimate, about 1.5 times the size of Gothic 3. Now, this is interesting because Risen 3 was actually touted as the largest world they had built so far, but this size was undercut by the island design, the landscape restrictions, and the loading screens. So I am really nervous to see how they pull this off, because we know that their game engine for Gothic 3 did not have the ability to really render an entire world of that size all at once. And we know that they've worked on the engine, but there has been a limitation that they've suffered from for pretty much its entire lifespan. So, once again, here's hoping that they can actually pull this off without any technical difficulties. It seems like the Berserkers are not in 100% agreement of how they treat technology, so some groups may be more accepting of it than others. there might be a group of berserkers who don't really care what you do as long as you're helping their cause. Meanwhile, there might be others who are vehemently opposed to it and will not even associate with you. But overall, it seems to be implied that policing the player's use of technology is not really the faction's biggest concern at the moment. They've got bigger things to worry about, such as the elves and the clerics trying to, stomp them into the dust. So what you do doesn't really matter to them as long as it's helping them. It's been stated that the assets, such as buildings and ruins, are supposed to be unique to their climate zones and are not supposed to just be cut and paste. So there's going to be a more, each stone wall you see is supposed to be, custom made and placed exactly where it is for a reason. You're not going to see like desert buildings in the middle of the forest or that kind of thing. Every asset was custom designed for its own specific area. It's good to note that the melee attacks will not carry the player across distances to hit the targets like it did in Risen 3. So, you don't have to worry about enemies simply launching themselves at you unexpectedly, and you also cannot close the distance and hit everything without even really aiming for it. So you have to make sure that you place yourself exactly where you need to be to hit the enemy. It's been stated that no DLC is planned at the moment, which is a good sign, suggesting that Day 1 DLC will not exist for this game. But we're still many months away from release, so this is, of course, subject to change. A lot of design decisions can happen at the last minute. It would be unreasonable to assume that there will not be any DLC for this game at all, and that they're not planning to develop some at some point. But that all does kind of depend on the success of the game when it's launched, and it's not like Piranha Bytes are opposed to the idea of creating expansions. After all, they've done it with Gothic 2, and they've done it with the later Risen games. Very curious to know is that while the weight class of your armor does not seem to affect your movement and attack speed, it is implied that the weight of your weapon will actually do that. So if you're, using a light sword, you can move faster and you can dodge farther. But if you're using a supermassive weapon like a giant hammer or, a big cannon or something like that, your movement speed will be hindered and your dodge distance and animation will be altered. So whereas if you have a light weapon, you can roll away quite a great distance, but if you have a heavy weapon, you can only do like a quick step to the side, which may not carry you out of harm's way. So it's nice to know that they are, in fact, trying to balance the power and potency of these massive weapons by limiting your mobility, which is the, predictable and reasonable way to do it. Now, naturally, enemies will have different weaknesses and resistances to make different weapons more viable against certain enemy types than others, and customization of weapons is supposed to be able to enhance this, such as adding new effects to melee weapons and using different ammo types for firearms. So it's nice to know that that kind of variety exists, because in most of their previous games, you could really just take one weapon and run with it, and there were very few enemies that resisted one type of damage more heavily than another. One of few games that really seemed to do that were the first and second Gothic games, where enemies made of stone, for example, resisted magic a lot more, and they were more vulnerable to ice damage or bludgeoning weapons. So hopefully that's expanded on quite a bit more here, but once again, that remains to be seen. Okay, so that's just about everything I have for this video. Hopefully I didn't miss anything, and hopefully I didn't talk your ear off. I know this video ran a bit longer than I was really intending, as usual. But if you enjoyed it and if you learned something, please make sure you subscribe to us here on YouTube, as well as follow us on Facebook and join our forums at World of ELEX. Everything will be linked in the description below. And you can rely on us to provide you all of the updates and new information as soon as it is available. But until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we will see you all next time.